Roxbury, Boston. A night in early 1942. Malcolm Little, 17 years old, not yet Detroit red, but well on his way to becoming him, stood in the cramped bathroom of a rented room, leaning over a chipped porcelain sink, staring into a small cracked mirror. His scalp burned, not figuratively, literally, chemically burned, the way it always burned when he gave himself a conk. The process of straightening his naturally tight curls into smooth, glossy, white-imitating style that every ambitious young black man in Roxbury wore if he wanted to be seen as sharp, modern somebody. The mixture was homemade, the way most black men made it in the 1940s when professional treatments cost money few of them had. Lie. The same caustic substance used to make soap and clear drains mixed with eggs and potatoes to cut the burn, combed through hair until it lay flat and straight, rinsed out the moment the pain became unbearable, sometimes a moment too late. Malcolm's scalp was raw that night, the skin along his hairline blistered, his eyes still watering from the chemical sting. He looked at himself in the mirror. He had done this to himself voluntarily, paid for the privilege, endured the burning, all to look less like what he actually was. And in that specific moment, staring at his own raw, reddened scalp in a cracked mirror in a cold Boston bathroom, something shifted inside him that would take years to fully understand, but that he would later identify, with the precision he brought to everything once he found his voice, as the first independent thought he ever had in his life. To understand the way of that mirror, you have to understand what the conk represented in black communities across America in the 1940s, and what it had already cost Malcolm by the time he gave himself one for the first time. Malcolm Little had grown up in Lansing, Michigan, the son of Earl Little, a Baptist preacher and devoted organizer for Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, a movement built entirely around a radical idea that black people did not need to look, sound, or live like white people to claim full human dignity. Garvey's philosophy insisted on black pride exactly as black people existed. Their skin, their hair, their features, their culture, celebrated rather than apologized for. Earl Little had raised his children on this philosophy until white supremacists murdered him when Malcolm was 6 years old, and the state took his mother away when Malcolm was 13, and the careful architecture of pride his parents had tried to build inside him collapsed under the weight of loss, poverty, and a foster care system that scattered the family to the wind. By the time Malcolm arrived in Boston at 15 to live with his half-sister Ella, the Garveyite teachings of his childhood had become distant abstract, disconnected from the immediate, urgent question of how a poor, untethered black teenager survived and thrived in a world that offered him almost nothing. What Boston offered Malcolm, through the lens of Roxbury's nightlife and the older men he began to idolize, was a different answer to the question of dignity. Not Garvey's answer. Pride in blackness as it naturally existed. A competing answer that had taken root across urban black America during the same decades. That proximity to whiteness, performed through grooming, dress, and style, was itself a form of status and survival. The conk was the most visible expression of this logic. Straightened hair, styled to mimic the texture white men wore naturally, became a marker of sophistication in certain black social circles, a way of signaling that you were not a field hand, not unrefined, not what white America's worst stereotypes insisted black people inherently were. Malcolm watched the older hustlers and musicians he admired in Roxbury wear their hair this way, watched how it seemed to grant them a particular kind of confidence, a particular kind of access to the dance halls and jazz clubs where social hierarchies were built and enforced through exactly these visual codes. Malcolm took a job shining shoes at the Roseland Ballroom, working the crowd of musicians, dancers, and hustlers who passed through nightly, and he studied them with the intensity of a young man determined to understand the unwritten rules of a world he desperately wanted entry into. He noticed who got respect and who didn't. He noticed that the men with conked hair, sharp zoot suits, and confident swagger moved through the room differently than men who didn't bother with any of it. He decided at 16 that he wanted that too, not out of some abstract philosophical commitment to anything, but out of the much more immediate, much more human desire of a poor teenager who had lost his family and stability, and wanted, more than almost anything, to belong somewhere, to be seen as someone who mattered. He saved money from his shoeshine job, week after week, until he had enough. He bought the ingredients. And on a night in early 1942, with a friend's help the first time, and alone in subsequent attempts, he gave himself his first conk. The physical process of conking hair in the 1940s, before commercial relaxers made the procedure marginally safer, was genuinely brutal, and Malcolm later described it in his autobiography with unflinching, almost clinical detail, precisely because he wanted readers to understand the true cost of what he had been chasing. The lye mixture had to be combed through the hair and left on long enough to break down the curl pattern, but every additional second risked chemical burns to the scalp, the kind of burns that could blister skin and, in severe cases, cause permanent damage. There was no safe threshold, only a narrow window between insufficient straightening and genuine injury, and inexperienced teenagers attempting this process on themselves or on each other in cramped bathrooms, without proper ventilation or protective equipment, frequently overshot that window. Malcolm overshot it more than once. He described the sensation as feeling like his scalp was being scalded with hot grease, a pain so intense that his eyes watered involuntarily and his entire body wanted to recoil even as he forced himself to hold still, because pulling away too soon meant the chemical hadn't worked long enough and he would have endured the pain for nothing. On this particular night, in early 1942, the burn had been worse than usual. He had left the lye in slightly too long, distracted by a friend talking to him through the bathroom door, and by the time he rinsed out under the cold tap water, his scalp was raw along the hairline, small blisters already rising at his temples. He stood at the sink afterward, breathing hard, the immediate pain beginning to recede into a dull, throbbing ache, and he looked up into the small cracked mirror above the sink to check the results. What stared back at him should have been, by the logic he'd absorbed from his environment, a triumph. Hair lying flat and glossy, the curl pattern erased, a look that approximated, however imperfectly, the hair texture of the white men whose approval and whose world he had been taught, implicitly and explicitly, to court. And by that narrow measure, it was a triumph. The conk had worked. His hair was straight. But Malcolm did not see triumph in the mirror that night. He saw, for the first time with real clarity, the actual mechanics of what he had just done to himself. He saw the raw, reddened skin along his hairline. He saw the small blisters beginning to form. He saw his own reflection through eyes still watering from chemical irritation, and something in that specific convergence of physical pain and visual self-confrontation forced a question into his mind that he had never consciously articulated before, even though, he would later realize, it had been pressing against the edges of his thoughts for years. The question was simple, and it was devastating once asked. Why was he willingly burning his own scalp, paying money he barely had, enduring real physical pain, in order to make himself look less like himself and more like someone he was not and would never actually become? No amount of lye would make him white. No amount of pain would change the fundamental fact of who he was. He was inflicting genuine injury on his own body in pursuit of an approximation, a performance, a kind of visual apology for the texture of hair he had been born with. He stood there at the sink, scalp throbbing, and the question simply would not release him. Malcolm later wrote about this exact moment in his autobiography with Alex Haley, and the language he chose reveals how significant he considered it to be decades after the fact, looking back across the entire arc of his transformation from Detroit Red to Malcolm X. He described looking at his first conk in the mirror and feeling, for the first time, a flicker of something he only called shame. Not shame at being black, but shame at what he had just done to disguise it. Shame at having internalized so completely the idea that his natural hair texture was something to be chemically erased rather than simply worn. He wrote that this was, in his words, my first really big step toward self-degradation, a phrase he chose with characteristic precision, because by the time he was dictating his autobiography to Haley in the early 1960s, he had spent years developing the analytical vocabulary to name exactly what happened to him as a teenager standing at that sink. He also identified the moment of looking in that mirror, processing the pain and the absurdity of what he'd done, as something closer to an awakening than a simple defeat. The very first crack in a belief system he hadn't realized he'd absorbed until he saw its physical consequences burned into his own scalp. The two readings are not contradictory. They are the same moment examined from different distances. In the immediate aftermath, standing at the sink at 17, Malcolm felt only confusion and a vague, unnamed discomfort he could not yet articulate. Looking back decades later, with the full weight of his political and spiritual transformation behind him, he could finally name what that discomfort had actually been. The first stirring of mind beginning, almost involuntarily, to question what it had been told to accept. He did not stop conking his hair immediately after that night. The habits and social pressures that had led him to the lye mixture in the first place did not disappear because of one uncomfortable mirror moment. He would continue conking his hair for years afterward, well into his 20s, through his Detroit Red period as a hustler and numbers runner in Boston and Harlem, through his early arrests, into his time in prison. But something had been planted that night that did not fully germinate until years later, in a prison cell, when Malcolm encountered the teachings of the Nation of Islam and, with them, a fully articulated framework for understanding exactly what that mirror had shown him, that the impulse to chemically alter his hair in pursuit of proximity to whiteness was not a personal, isolated choice, but a symptom of something much larger, a psychological wound inflicted by centuries of systematic messaging that told black people their natural features were inferior, undesirable, something to overcome rather than something to claim. When Malcolm finally stopped conking his hair, years later, the decision carried weight precisely because of where it had started. He described the day he let his hair grow out naturally for the first time since adolescence as a kind of liberation, a small, private rebellion that mirrored the much larger psychological and political transformation he was undergoing simultaneously. He would go on to become one of the most visible, most articulate critics of what he called the psychological damage white supremacy inflicted on black Americans. The internalized self-hatred that manifested in skin bleaching creams, in hair straightening, in an entire economy and culture built around the premise that blackness, as it naturally existed, needed correction. When Malcolm X stood before audiences in the 1950s and 1960s and spoke about the specific form of damage, he was not speaking abstractly, theoretically, from outside the experience. He was speaking from precise memory of standing at a cracked bathroom mirror in Roxbury in 1942, scalp burning, staring at his own reflection, and feeling for the first time the dissonance between what he had been taught to want and what he actually was. The significance of that mirror moment extends beyond Malcolm's personal biography into something that illuminates the broader psychological terrain black Americans navigated throughout the 20th century, and that many continue to navigate today. The conk was never simply a hairstyle. It was a physical, painful, expensive ritual performed by millions of black men across decades, a ritual that required burning one's own scalp in pursuit of an aesthetic standard defined entirely by proximity to a racial category one could never actually join. Entire industries grew up around this demand. Chemical manufacturers, barbershops specializing in the process, advertisements in black newspapers promising safer, gentler formulas that nonetheless still relied fundamentally on caustic chemicals applied directly to the scalp. Malcolm's later writing about the conk became one of the most quoted, most taught passages in his entire body of work precisely because it crystallized, in a single vivid image, the larger argument he spent his life making. That white supremacy did not only operate through laws, violence, and economic exclusion, but through a deeper, more insidious colonization of the mind, one that convinced its victims to participate willingly, even eagerly, in their own diminishment. Generations of black scholars, educators, and cultural critics have returned to this passage in the decades since, using it as a teaching tool precisely because of how viscerally it captures something that can otherwise remain abstract, the lived, physical, bodily cost of internalized racial hierarchy. The mirror in that Roxbury bathroom did not show Malcolm the truth all at once. The full clarity of what he glimpsed that night would not arrive until years later, refined through prison, through study, through the Nation of Islam's teachings, through his own relentless intellectual hunger to understand exactly why he felt compelled to burn his own scalp in pursuit of a standard that was never built to include him. But the mirror showed him something. A crack. A question he could not unask once it had been asked. Decades later, when Malcolm X stood before television cameras and university audiences and spoke with devastating clarity about the psychology of racial self-hatred, about the billion-dollar industries built on convincing black people their natural selves require correction, about the specific cruelty of a system that didn't just oppress people from outside, but trained them to oppress themselves from within, he was drawing on a well of understanding that began, in its earliest and most literal form, with physical pain and a cracked mirror in a cold Boston bathroom. He was 17 years old. He did not yet have the language for what he was feeling. He would not become Malcolm X for another decade. But the boy who stood at that sink scalp raw and throbbing, staring at a reflection that was both a triumph by the standards he'd absorbed and, somehow, simultaneously, a small private wound, had already taken a first step toward becoming someone who would spend the rest of his life refusing to apologize for exactly what he was. He just didn't know it yet. He only knew that something about what he saw in that mirror would not let him go.